same point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As again, it's always a great honour to stand in this House. I'd like to offer some additional comments on the question of privilege that I raised on October 17th regarding misleading statements made by the Prime Minister in this House in relation to the secret and potentially criminal payout to Mike Duffy. And more specifically, I feel I need to add to this issue in order to answer the intervention yesterday by the government House Leader. First, let me say I was very disappointed that the government House Leader would try to say that this issue was, quote, absurd or a political stunt. I hope that given the seriousness of the matter before Parliament, that the House Leader would not have taken it so lightly and would not have tried to shove it aside. Because, Mr. Speaker, this is not an issue that can be brushed aside, because Parliament is where the laws of this land are made, and there is an obligation for all of us to meet a certain standard. Canadians want answers in this very disturbing and squalid scandal, and they want to know what happened. So when the Prime Minister was asked questions and provided false information, he interfered with the rights of the members of this House. Now, one of the government House Leader's argument yesterday is that it is a long-established practice in the House that parliamentarians are to be taken at their word. And indeed, that is a practice which is essential for the workings of a democratic institution, and we agree with him, which is why the issue of a minister knowingly misrepresenting facts to his colleagues in the House, or misrepresenting facts because his staff misled him, is a breach of the privileges of the members of this House and can be found to be a contempt of the workings of Parliament. What we're talking about right now, Mr. Speaker, is not he said, she said, as being inferred by the government House Leader, but facts that have been shown to be false through the affidavits of the RCMP and through now other statements that have come forward. The government House Leader says that we must take parliamentarians at their word, and yet we have a situation where we now have two parliamentarians who have made completely contradictory declarations about the role that they played in an issue that is under investigation by the RCMP. So it is essential that we find out the true answers. Yesterday in the speech to the Senate, Mike Duffy was categorical in stating that the Prime Minister's office was involved in the secret negotiations for the $90,000 check, and that the Prime Minister himself was directly involved in negotiations with Mike Duffy. Senator Duffy said the Prime Minister himself had ordered him to repay his living expenses because they had become a political problem for the Conservatives. He said that at a meeting on February 13, 2013, between him, the Prime Minister, and Nigel Wright, quote, just the three of us. The Prime Minister told him, quote, it's not about what you did. It's about the perception of what you did that's been created in the media. The rules are inexplicable to our base. Duffy said, I was ordered by the Prime Minister to pay the money back, end of discussion. Mr. Speaker, these comments are very troubling because they contradict the statements that was made by the Prime Minister in this House, which he reiterated again today when he said that he spoke to Mike Duffy at a caucus meeting. The appearance that was given to the House of Commons that this was in passing. And at the time when the Prime Minister made those comments, he said that he told Mr. Duffy that if the expenses were inappropriate, he should pay them back. The Prime Minister now today gives us, number one, the statement that he was categorical, that he was emphatic that Mike Duffy had misrepresented his claims and was ordered to pay that back. That's different than what the Prime Minister said earlier. But the Prime Minister was asked today about whether or not there was, as Mike Duffy said, just the three of us, Nigel Wright, Mike Duffy, and the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister went back to saying that this meeting happened at a caucus meeting. Mr. Speaker, both men are giving completely contradictory information, and we certainly as parliamentarians, in order to do our job, need to know. So we can't believe both of them. So what is it that we should do here? Certainly, Mr. Speaker, if we were dealing with he said, she said on some minor matter, this would not be a matter of privilege. But the issue before us, Mr. Speaker, is that there is evidence prepared by Corporal Greg Horton, peace officer of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, delivered in court in an application for a production order that presents evidence that is in clear contradiction to the Prime Minister's position. The Prime Minister had said in this House, and it was reiterated by his parliamentary secretary on Monday, that Nigel Wright had acted alone. According now to the police evidence, we began to see more names appear of who was involved in the Prime Minister's office. That brought us at least Chris Woodcock, David Hemmen, Benjamin Perrin, who knew, and this is from the RCMP. However, now, over the revelations of the last 2 days, we see that there's at least 13 key Conservatives who were involved in this deal that may be found to be an illegal payout. Nigel Wright, Benjamin Perrin, Chris Woodcock, Mr. Van Hemmen, Patrick Rogers, all directly within the Prime Minister's office. So the claim that Mr. Wright acted without anyone else, the Prime Minister started to slowly change his position, but he was emphatic in June, and we were led to believe him. We now know that Senators LeBreton, Tkachuk, Stuart Olson, Finley, Gerstein, LeBreton were involved in this negotiations. Jenny Byrne was involved. Mike Duffy now tells us that Ray Novak and Senator LeBreton said they were speaking on behalf of the Prime Minister. And what's very troubling is that Mr. Duffy says he was told by them that there would be a deal if he did not go along quietly, that they would have him expelled from the Senate for not meeting the housing requirements. So either Mr. Duffy met the housing requirements or he didn't, which again contradicts what the Prime Minister has said previously. Mr. Speaker, the Government House Leader yesterday suggested in his answer to the question that the one of the precedent that I mentioned from 1978 of a similar case cannot be used because, in contrary to that case, we do not have an admission of wrongdoing from the Prime Minister or his staff. Well, Mr. Speaker, that argument simply doesn't hold up because it's based on an equivalency of saying that, well, anyone can provide false statements to the House as long as they don't admit it. And what kind of parliament would we have if that was the case? For my colleagues' benefit, let me again mention another precedent from 2002, when the member for Portage-Lisker said that the Minister of Defence had misled the House regarding the detention of Afghan prisoners. And this case was found by Speaker Milliken to be a prima facie case of privilege. Let me quote Speaker Milliken on this. The authorities are consistent about the need for clarity in our proceedings and about the need to ensure the integrity of the information provided by the government to the House. As the honourable member for Acadie-Bathurst has pointed out, in deciding on alleged questions of privilege, it's relatively infrequent for the chair to find prima facie privilege. It is more likely that the Speaker will characterize the situation as a dispute of facts. But in the case before us, there appears to be, in my opinion, no dispute as to the facts. I believe that both the Minister and other honourable members recognize that two versions of the events have been presented to the House. Continuing on, he says, on the basis of the arguments presented by honourable members and in view of the gravity of the matter, I have concluded that the situation before us, where the House is left with two versions of events, is one that merits further consideration by an appropriate committee, if only to clear the air. And I think, Mr. Speaker, we've had such good judicious rulings through the years. I think this is certainly a very appropriate one to be looking at. In presenting his arguments, the Government House Leader also mentioned a ruling in 1987 by Speaker Fraser. Let me quote again from this judgment because it offers very clear advice on what we should do in the present case. These institutions, Parliament and the courts, enjoy the protection of absolute privilege because of the overriding need to ensure that truth can be told. Such a privilege confers grave responsibility on those who are protected by that. And by that I mean specifically the honourable members of this place. The consequences of its abuse can be terrible. All honourable members are conscious of the care they must exercise in availing themselves of their absolute privilege of freedom of speech. That is why there are long-standing practices and traditions observed in this House to counter the potential for abuse. Mr. Speaker, the freedom of speech that we protect for the members in this House means that neither I nor any citizen of Canada can go to the courts on a case based on something that the Prime Minister has said in this chamber. But as Speaker Fraser said, we do have practices and tradition in this institution that allows us to deal with cases of abuse of freedom of speech, because such abuses can be detrimental to Parliament and to the democratic life of Canadians. And this is exactly the situation we're faced with today. It's certainly an unprecedented situation and very, very grave and serious, which is why, again, I felt the need to rise again. The recourse is we have to get to the bottom of this disturbing story, and that way to do that, Mr. Speaker, is to refer it to an in-depth study at the Committee of the Procedure and House Affairs. Mr. Speaker, again, let me repeat that we are not in the domain of simple assertions here. We are talking about facts that have been brought forward through RCMP investigation, which is that the Prime Minister repeatedly said in the House that no one in his office knew of the Wright Duffy deal, but we now know that it is anywhere from 3 within his office to 13 key people around the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, you will remember my previous intervention that I put forward 2 possibilities. Either the Prime Minister misled the House himself, or his own staff in the Prime Minister's office had gone rogue behind his back and misled him. Either of these cases is a breach of contempt of Parliament and a breach of the privileges of the members of this House. We cannot, as the government House Leader said, just shove this matter aside and hope it will, to clarify, we cannot have, as the government House Leader would have it, just shove this matter aside and hope that it will disappear on its own. We need to shed light on this matter, and the only way to do this is by finding that this is a prima facie case of the abuse of our privilege. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Government House Leader.